Now that we're moving on to Ocarina of Time, I'll give a heads up that from here on, I'll be using clips from a live reaction from my brother that I recorded. My little brother isn't as hardcore into gaming or game design as I am. Put another way, he's more of a normie, so it's interesting to survey people who aren't invested in this kind of discussion, people who are more unbiased.
So now we have this 3D world, and it felt like that was what made the difference. But what exactly was different? Well, in order to examine that, we have to examine dreaded transition from the second dimension to the third dimension. If we've learned anything from Sonic the Hedgehog over here, it's that turning a 2D game into a 3D game, it ain't easy. It ain't even fucking quantifiable. How do you take the simplicity of form that 2D allows, give it a Z-axis? Everything changes, and it seems to turn a really good game design into a completely fucking broken one.
Alright, so far so good.
I mean, but Zelda, that one's not too hard. It already technically has 3 dimensions. You got the Y-axis, the X-axis, but you know, you could go upstairs, enemies could jump over you, all that stuff. Well, that's where the differences start. See, Link to the Past had a selective Z-axis. For example, you couldn't be on the second floor and attack a dude on the first floor, but if the sandworm boss soared over your head and you weren't harmed by it, you could still swing at it and it'd register a hit.
I want to take this moment to say that here we see Egoraptor is perfectly capable of providing clear and specific examples to make his point.
Bats fly through the air, but they're always conveniently at sword's height. That shit's asinine in 3D, which ironically in this situation is a limitation of the medium. The more specific you get about situations analogous to reality, the more you have to stipulate on.
This is a clumsy and convoluted way of making the fairly simple point that 3D is more complicated than 2D. You can only hit things when they are close enough. That's not a limitation of the medium.
You can't hit a bat from any Z-axis position distance. Now it's really clear where the bats are in 3D space. They're up, down, every fucking where. And aiming your sword would be retarded.
This is the first instance where Egoraptor's lack of skill, but more importantly, his attitude in response to that comes into question. But we'll have to come back to this later.
So what do we gotta do to remedy this Z-axis problem? Ladies and gents, I present you Z-targeting. Pesky bats flying from every which way, trying to circle around a Stalfos without losing track of where it is relative to you? Have I got a treat for you? Just press the Z button and lock onto the nearest baddie and have a go with your mighty sword device. Check it out. Z-targeting made combat complicated.
I figured you'd have something to say about that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, like, how are you going to lead up to that and then use the exact opposite word?
Yeah. You started off saying, oh, it's hard to hit things in 3D space. Here's a thing that makes it easier to hit things in 3D space.
Yeah.
By the way...
Yeah, it's like saying, here's their solution to the problem.
Yeah.
And then, well, you made it more complicated. What?
Simply put, Egoraptor is objectively wrong. Z-targeting makes things simpler and easier to manage.
And that's not a bad thing. No more simple point and swing stuff here, folks.
Yes, there is. You literally just walk up to them and swing, with or without Z-targeting.
You gotta lock on, focus on the fight. This is a gigantic difference, and it makes combat complex. I don't say this a lot, but let's see how this is a good thing.
Let's see how this is a good thing is something you don't say a lot? Evaluating the pros and cons is the most basic, fundamental aspect of critique. This may seem like a throwaway line, but it is a giveaway, a tacit admission of how Egoraptor fails to weigh the trade-offs of Ocarina's design, and how he doesn't have a good method of critique or analysis.
A new method of combat means new ways to go about designing enemies in combat situations. You used to just point and hit and run. What the fuck, man? But now, there's rolling, dodging, stabbing, swinging, leaping. Holy shit! So complex. So many possibilities.
Why does he act like he had like 100 moveset? It's not like there was an insane amount of moveset he had.
Right. Egoraptor's analysis of the combat here is shallow. Rather than explore or elaborate how the new mechanics impact combat, he just lists a bunch of them in an exaggerated way and vaguely states that there are so many possibilities. This is why I pointed out before when he was talking about the transition to 3D that he's perfectly capable of using clear and specific examples. Here, he neglects to do that. Instead, he lets them play in the background even though they overtly misalign with what he's saying. This is another example of Egoraptor suggesting a false dichotomy due to his thinking being constrained to the extremes. Combat is either simple point and swing stuff, or it's complex. In reality, the presence of options doesn't eliminate those simple strategies. The existence of rolling doesn't mean there's no more point and hit or hit and run. The existence of dodging doesn't mean there's no more point and hit or hit and run. The existence of leaping, or more accurately, having a jump attack, doesn't mean there's no more point and hit or hit and run. The existence of swinging doesn't... Why is that even in the list? In any case, this is demonstrably untrue, and Egoraptor's being misleading by shotgunning a list of mechanics in a hyperbolic, enthusiastic manner. Having extra moves doesn't mean you lose the ability to engage in straightforward hit-and-run combat. It just means you have options. Furthermore, dodging, leaping, rolling, these are all mechanics that exist independent of Z-targeting. It didn't add those mechanics, so this too is wrong. The reason why this matters is that when you make false causal relationships like this, it shows a lack of detailed understanding. This is how you come away with wrong conclusions. Lastly, his reasoning here is circular. Z-targeting made combat more complicated. That's not a bad thing, because it made combat more complicated. Even if we were to ignore the factual error about Z-targeting, but instead acknowledge that combat in Ocarina is indeed more complex, more so due to the shift to 3D, his argument here would still suffer on a structural level. Well-structured arguments should progress from premise to conclusion with clear evidence, not loop back in on itself.
It's so deep they can make an entire game based on the combat system, but guess what? They didn't! Here's how this is a poopy bad thing!
From here, Egoraptor shifts the topic to how Ocarina of Time not making the entire game about combat is a flaw. This kind of argument is inherently problematic because it shifts the focus away from analyzing what the game is and how well it accomplishes its design goals. Worse yet, since the prior section about the complexity of combat was filled with both factual errors and structural errors, the foundation of his argument is undercut before he even makes it. His complaint is built on shaky ground, which doesn't bode well.
Z-targeting creates a strange disconnect from the world around you. It changes the camera angle from what you're used to exploring the world in, and that shifts your entire focus and outlook. It segments the game into two pieces. This is the combat piece, this is the world exploring piece. They don't mix.
So they didn't base the whole game off of it, but it creates a strange disconnect.
From the world around you.
That's not even a logical consequence. In no uncertain terms, Egoraptor's statements here are just utter nonsense. There's no logical argument that's here. It doesn't follow that not making the entire game based on combat somehow makes a disconnect from the world around you. Changing the camera angle to fight enemies in a game entirely based on combat isn't a disconnect, but changing the camera angle to fight enemies in a game not entirely based on combat is? That doesn't make any sense. The claim that Z-targeting segments the game into two pieces is never substantiated. Even then, he fails to articulate why this supposed segmentation is actually a problem or how it negatively impacts the game. Egoraptor is relying on evocative phrasing and metaphorical language instead of analysis. We intuitively understand the idea of things not mixing, and the negative connotation on that and on a word like disconnect. But it's style over substance. It's about sounding convincing to those with less critical scrutiny, rather than making coherent arguments. Again, he doesn't go through specific examples to clarify what he means, and the only one that he provides in the background actually works against him. It's a clip of him fighting Astolphos and then falling into a hole that is in plain view. That's not a disconnect from the world around you. If only Nintendo had made the entire game around combat, then he would have been able to see the hole and not fall in it.
In the old Zelda games, those two pieces were linked. There were segments where you had to fight off enemies and explore the rooms simultaneously. It was much easier to manage it all, and now it's complicated and puts you in an unfair situation. What the heck was that all about?
Egoraptor's example of being able to explore and fight at the same time in the 2D games doesn't really matter, because even if we were to accept his point about them having exploration and combat linked, which is dubious, it doesn't logically follow that not having this puts you into unfair situations. The player having the ability to change the camera angle when they decide to fight or explore has nothing to do with fairness. That's a completely separate topic of discussion with its own considerations. Once more, Egoraptor's argument is flawed on a fundamental level, both factual and structural. On a factual level, because changing the camera angle via Z-targeting doesn't create a disconnect of any sort. On a structural level, because he conflates whether combat and exploration are linked with whether the game is fair. How does it put you into unfair situations exactly? He doesn't elaborate. He just plays a clip where he gets hit with no context. This is precisely how you don't use examples. Anyone can reasonably question what exactly he was doing before that caused him to get hit in that situation, because a major pitfall in discussions of fairness is mistaking player error for bad design. This is why it matters for Egoraptor to actually go through concrete examples instead of making a cutaway gag as though it was self-evident. Far from a critical and fair analysis, Egoraptor is demonstrating a lack of intellectual rigor and failing to engage critically with his own claims. Another aspect that is just as telling is that he says it was much easier to manage, even though Z-targeting is designed to make things in 3D easier to manage. But somehow, Z-targeting is the culprit for putting you in unfair situations. This fact makes it more apparent that the real issue isn't that the game is unfair because of some made-up nonsense theory about Z-targeting segmenting the game, but that the real issue is his lack of skill, and he's blaming the game for it. Fairness in game design is a complex topic that often involves multiple other topics of game design, such as the design of mechanics, the design of enemies, the design of level elements, and how those elements interact and are laid out relative to each other in the level design for any specific gameplay challenge. So there's a myriad of reasons across multiple categories of game design why something may be unfair. If Egoraptor wanted to make a solid argument about fairness, he would need to provide clear and specific examples for whatever he takes issue with, develop a well-defined criteria to differentiate between something that's fair versus something that's challenging, and apply that consistently to his examples. I said we would come back to this later when Egoraptor was first complaining about the bats in the section about the transition to 3D, so we'll come back to this shortly.
Z-targeting also puts a damper on throwaway enemies like bats, who were fun to kill in previous Zeldas, but are now a pain in the goddamn ass since you have to individually focus on each one and precisely hit them. It'd be like if you wanted to kill a bunch of ants in your house by stomping on them, but instead of doing that, you pointed a slingshot at each one individually.
So finally we can close this thread. Outside of the slingshotting ant analogy, what does Egoraptor say about the actual game? What is the actual analysis? Keese used to be fun to fight in the 2D games, but not anymore in the 3D games. And why is that? Because in his own words,
you have to individually focus on each one and precisely hit them.
Having to focus on each enemy and precisely hit them is just describing the act of playing an action game. It's a generic observation with no argument behind it. Not only is it so generic that you can say the same thing about a wide variety of action games, but it also describes the 2D Zelda games. Remember, he's trying to draw a contrast between Link to the Past and Ocarina of Time. The implication being that you don't do this in Link to the Past, which is just demonstrably wrong. When you look at his own provided footage, notice how he's doing exactly that, focusing on each enemy and precisely hitting them. See how he even misses a few times because he wasn't close enough. In no way does this showcase not having to focus or be precise. What does it mean to focus? To pay particular attention to. What does it mean to be precise? To be exact, accurate, and careful. This is effectively complaining about having to use skill, to use effort to influence the outcome. And the whole point of Z-targeting is to make this easier, yet he's blaming it. There is no further breakdown to clarify his point beyond this. Instead, he moves on to his slingshot analogy. Egoraptor's analogy is flawed on multiple levels. While we can intuitively understand the meaning behind it, that shooting ants with a slingshot is ineffective, cumbersome, and frustrating, he fails to show how that analogy applies to Ocarina of Time. This is where I should mention now that Egoraptor has an over-reliance on analogies. Analogies, when done well, are best used for clarification. They are not meant to replace a substantive analysis. That shit's asinine is not critique or analysis. It's a pain in the goddamn ass is not a critique or analysis. What is analysis? A detailed examination. Details. And when all that's effectively said is to complain about having to use skill, then all we're left with is opinion masquerading as critique that says more about Egoraptor than the game he's commenting on. That his understanding of combat in general is shallow, but also inaccurate to both 2D and 3D Zelda alike.
Now, okay, on the flip side, complicated enemies are a total joy to fight. But the issue then comes up of how they're even designed. Okay, so as I mentioned before, a lot of the charm from the original Zelda was how ruthless the game was, and a complex fighting system would be perfect place to implement that. But the source of a lot of Ocarina's problems is that the game's idea of difficulty is waiting. There is so much goddamn waiting in Ocarina. Every enemy has a period where they just stand around and do fucking nothing, and attacking them during this time is useless. Deku Scrubs, Stalfos, Lizardmen, Skulltulas, Wolf Dudes, Gerudos, Clams?
At first glance, it may seem like Egoraptor has made a decent point. He gave a criteria this time for what he took issue with regarding the enemy design. Enemies standing around doing nothing, and more importantly, that attacking them during this time is useless. Both of these are things that we can observe and verify. The problem is that that's not what his example actually showed. While true, the Stalfos itself is standing around, or more accurately, it's strafing around, but it's not attacking, so sure, we can take that as it doing nothing. The fact is that so is Egoraptor. He's doing nothing. This doesn't show that attacking is useless. And if Egoraptor wanted to prove the point that attacking was useless, he needs to actually show it. Use different sword attacks, use items, actually exhaust all the options, because it doesn't make sense to blame a game for not having options when you don't even explore those options. So once again, the issue is that Egoraptor fails to properly examine his own examples. This time though, it's less a problem of omission and more a rush to confirmation. He sees what he wants to see and thinks it proves his point. It's not a single instance of being wrong, but a recurring failure that results from a weak critical method. And anyone that's knowledgeable about the Stalfos and Ocarina of Time will know that they're way more vulnerable than Egoraptor is letting on.
Waiting is not a difficult thing to do, but it creates the illusion of difficulty because it takes up your time. And that's all it does. A fight feels like an ordeal when you have to devote a decent amount of time to it, but it's not hard. Just look at Final Fantasy IX, Skies of Arcadia, Grandia. These long-ass battles, not hard, but they feel like there's something. This is a mindless interaction, and you're simply going through the motions instead of strategizing. Wait, attack, wait, attack, wait. It's not very hard to do, and it's difficult to mess up. This style of enemy isn't inherently bad. I mean, it creates an interesting player-enemy relationship where the enemy's controlling the pace of the battle, but the fact that it's a consistent theme in enemies gives the impression that it's used as a difficulty supplement, since none of these enemies are actually difficult to fight.
The word waiting carries a negative connotation to many people. Most of us can relate to experiences where we had to wait that were irritating, whether it's waiting in traffic, waiting in line, or waiting for someone to answer the phone. So it may seem like Egoraptor is making a decent point here, identifying something that irritates most people, because after all, everybody can think of experiences that would have been better if they didn't have to wait. But what does it actually mean to wait? To wait means to delay action or remain in a state of anticipation until a specific moment occurs. This is a very neutral definition that applies to many contexts. Where Egoraptor overreaches is referring to it as a mindless interaction, that it's something difficult to mess up. This is wrong, because waiting is part of both skills of timing and skills of reflex. Waiting in this context requires effort and attentiveness to influence the outcome. That's the opposite of mindless. This is also why the comparison earlier to a bunch of turn-based RPGs was faulty. They don't stress real-time skills of timing or reflex, so the waiting in a turn-based game is not the same as the waiting in a real-time action game. And to describe combat as being just wait attack is to not only misunderstand how waiting is a fundamental part of combat, but a crude attempt to oversimplify combat across the entire game. To flatten the range of player actions and decisions into just 2 words, to make combat sound like it's static, rigid, repetitive, and lacking in interplay and variation, hence the phrase, going through the motions. But if that were true, the fights shown in his own footage here would all look the same. but they don't, because real variation, timing, and player agency are on full display. The combat shown is more dynamic than Egoraptor is letting on. Again, the issue is he's not actually going through concrete examples. He's not doing any analysis. Putting up a collage of footage in the background that's tangentially related to what he's saying should not be mistaken for as going through examples. Never mind the issue that listing only 7 enemies out of a game with well over 3 dozen is hardly establishing a pattern, especially when his own footage doesn't align with what he's claiming.
Now, on the flip side, Ocarina has the coolest enemy ever, the Iron Knuckle. It's an enemy that is actually provoked to attack and also to be vulnerable by your own attack, which makes the pace of the battle completely dictated by you and your ability to fight it. Additionally, the nature of his attack pattern requires you to be aware of your surroundings. You can lure him to attack pillars, which yield hearts to replenish your life, which is another layer of depth to the battle. Hearts to replenish your life, which is a...
I thought you were detached.
Yeah, now all of a sudden you can see the pillars.
But you couldn't see the gigantic hole in the floor.
Yeah. Egoraptor's points about the Iron Knuckle here is muddled and overstated. For one, Iron Knuckles force you to respond whenever they attack. There's give and take like any other enemy, but not full player control. And because you have to respond to the Iron Knuckles attacks, this means that one of the things you have to do to successfully counter it is wait. That's why Egoraptor's earlier summary of wait attack is so throwaway. Having to wait to time your attacks or react to things is just describing the act of playing an action game, whether it's Mega Man, Castlevania, or the 2D Zelda games. And as my brother noted earlier, Egoraptor's point about the Iron Knuckle requiring you to be aware of your surrounding contradicts what he said earlier about Z-targeting causing you to be detached. In reality, every fight requires you to be aware of your surroundings. So Egoraptor is trying to draw a contrast to things that are either still present in the Iron Knuckle, or to things that many other enemies already do, like reacting to your attacks. Altogether, Egoraptor's praise lacks clarity and precision.
This is the kind of enemy design Ocarina needed so much more of. A merging of combat and world, where you are still very aware of your surrounding in each set piece, even during combat, and the world around you affects your combat. I feel that this particular battle shows how Ocarina could have had an even better combat world connection than Link to the Past, or even the original Zelda, but chose to save it only for mini bosses and some boss battles. Could have been every enemy.
It had a better combat world connection.
Yeah. And by better combat world connection, it's that the enemy didn't attack and it broke something in the environment. That's about it.
Yeah, I know. I would love to hear his description of a combat world connection. Because it's like, when you set up an argument, you have to think about, what is the, the counter argument. You always have to think about the counter argument, how you're going to go against that, how to defend yourself. He's not doing that. He's not even thinking about, I can break down your argument so easily.
Yeah.
Showing all the flaws in it. Like, you don't even attempt to try to defend yourself or establish your standpoint or your argument. You're just saying shit.
The game is 3D. Combat occurs in 3D spaces, ergo those spaces affect your combat. He defines a merger of combat and world as being aware of your surroundings during combat and the world around you affecting your combat. Neither of those two things are unique or exclusive to the Iron Knuckle fight. How do you not have the world affect your combat when all combat takes place in the world? This isn't a turn-based RPG where there's no spatial dynamics at play. Egoraptor's statements here, once again, are just utter nonsense. More unproductive yet is that Egoraptor is falling into the trap of armchair game director territory. It's easy to be disappointed to compare an existing finished game to an imaginary one where you don't have any of the ideas or details worked out. It can be fun to speculate, but this is not relevant to critique, especially when it's this kind of speculation without foundation or clarity. From here, Egoraptor makes a jarring shift in topic to puzzles, but it's evident at this point that Egoraptor is not capable of providing fair and critical analysis. From cherry-picking, to contradictions, to shifting standards, to faulty comparisons. Whether his video is a product of motivated reasoning doesn't matter as much as the fact that he lacks any critical framework. He doesn't analyze examples closely, doesn't define his evaluative criteria clearly, and often relies on surface-level impressions or rhetorical shortcuts instead of thoughtful analysis. Add to that the fact that Egoraptor's video lacks structure. Note how he loses track of his own thesis. We started the video asking what the core of Zelda actually is, and whether the following Zelda formula, whatever that is, may be missing the point of what makes Zelda or sequels in general great. Instead, the video has drifted into isolated complaints about combat and sets out on a completely different, irrelevant argument about why Ocarina not making the entire game based around combat because of Z-targeting is a bad thing, a criteria that was never established as central to its identity. And it's not going to get better.